right? And this is the only thing I want, right? I want to have the choice, and that's basically the only thing I will fight for, right?
And sensorically, how would you differentiate the Helles from Burgdorfer to the Feldschlösschen you just had?
Right, so the Helles, I would say this is more malts driven, probably because they also use some like caramel malts, which is again more like German tradition. Back in the day, so the Helles was initially made based on a recipe from a really traditional German brewer. So when they started, they had a German brewer. Or was it a German? I would have to check this as well. Anyway, he was really a good brewer, and he established, let's say, the main recipes. So for the Helles, the Emme, which is the Dunkles, and the Weizen, which I think are more or less the same recipes still up today. Don't quote me on that, but I think they are very more or less stay the same throughout. Which
style-wise, there is a tradition there.
Yeah, exactly. And they never changed this. Again, never change a winning system, which they didn't. And the Helles is like, let's say, a go-to. It's more malt-based. I think it's more like viscous as well, because there is more flavor and more biscuity flavors coming to it. Based on the bitterness, I think it's even less or lower than the Feldschlösschen. But again, I think that has to do with like how the sweetness actually builds up a completely different mouth feel. Probably, right?
Yeah. Now it gets really interesting because you have a position in your own range that holds that position in terms of an alternative to a lager.
Right, you have to.
I have both of those bottles here. The classic one and also one which you then can explain how they differentiate. But first, please introduce the Artemis Saison.
So the Artemis, right, so this is our, let's say, one of the core brands we brew year out. It's made with local spelt. As I said, it's like with spelt that was sourced within like a very short radius around the brewery. It is obviously made with our own yeast. Very, very pungent in the nose, I would say. But again, very decent or very subtle in terms of the flavor profile, because we somehow over the years learned how to actually have a certain yeast profile expressed or not, meaning to have more, let's say, wheat character, or meaning wheat beer characters like banana / phenolics compound, or if you actually change certain things to have it less aggressive, which I think it's more or less what we have here. But it's obviously also a big difference with this compared to the others is the sweetness level, because our yeasts, they eat everything. So meaning the gravities are really close to gravity of 1000 or 0 Plato, meaning there is nothing really left in terms of sugars, which give you a sweet
but also impression. Kind of dry basis, which is also a great contrast for all the sensoric information.
Right, so there you go. This is like, let's say, the output, or the essentially what actually happens because there is no sweetness, right? The beer seems to be quite dry, right? But again, it also makes it's easier to digest, in my opinion, because it's not like sweet. There is nothing cloying, nothing really pungent or, let's say, harassing you if you have a really sweet sticky beer, where you say, well, one sip is nice, the second one is like really already hard to get through. With this, there is nothing really holding you back to get to a second sip, right?
It seems that there is common ground in terms of drinkability with the three beers we just tasted.
Right.
So different beer styles.
Right.
We need to say that because Feldschlösschen is a lager.
Right.
The Helles is specifically a.
I think it's, as far as I know, it's a Dortmunder lager. So it's still a lager, but it's more like the Dortmunder style, if I'm correct, is more like malt. Forward. I think the Feldschlösschen is maybe closer to a traditional Czech Pils, although, I mean, the IBUs / the, let's say, the hop character is probably missing, which again is however you basically interpret the style, let's say. Right?
It's nothing to challenge the drinkability of the beer for sure.
No.
So starting from the Feldschlösschen to the Helles to now your Saison, which I would say is just as drinkable.
Right.
But just like the more malt-forward character of the Helles is something that I find as an improvement on the sensoric experience.
Right.
There is again an improvement to the Dinkel Saison, to the Rye Saison? Spelt Saison.
Yes, spelt.
To the Spelt Saison that you are offering up to the consumer as an alternative to both a lager and a Dortmunder Helles.
Right. But there again, I mean, the biggest difference, what I would say is, I would say the Feldschlösser is more hop forward, because there's nothing about the malt. The Helles is more about the malt, obviously, and we basically somehow like leave away the entire sweetness, right? So this is for sure maybe a bit off the chart if you basically combine the two, because it's not really what you would expect from a beer, right? Which is mostly, there is some sweetness which is more or less in balance with the bitterness, more or less, right? The Helles is really well balanced, right? I wouldn't be surprised if the IBU of the Helles is actually
so the bitterness level.
Right, so the bitterness level of the Helles is at the same level as the Feldschlösser. It's just like differently masked by the sweetness of the Helles, right?
Of the malt.
Right, exactly.
The car malt.
Exactly.
The different malts.
Exactly. For our case, it's probably lower, the hops, because there is no sweetness to actually, let's say, hide the IBUs / the bitterness. So the only way is to actually counterbalance. I mean, let's say we can't really make a balance between the sweetness and the bitterness, because there is no sweetness. So our own balance, or only balance, is just how bitter do we actually make the beer, right?
I think, especially if we're talking about Saison as a style, and why for me it's sensorically an improvement on the Helles, we need to talk about acidity.
Right.
Because that's something that is already a big challenge for a classic lager beer drinker.
It is, right. And there again, it's also, some people would say the Artemis that we have is acidic. Others say, well, it's not. I think I'm more in the opinion that it's not, but I might be somehow biased. Plus, I don't really mind acidity. Second of all, I think it has to do something with, again, how can you actually mask certain flavors? Because if you would measure the pH of all the three beers, I wouldn't be surprised if the pH is all the same. Why is it that ours is maybe more, let's say, sour in terms of perceived sourness? Probably has to do again with masking. There is no sweetness that could mask the sourness, right? There is no really harsh bitterness again, which can't really interact or like mask the sourness. So if our beers actually appear to be sour, I'm not really too surprised about it, because there is nothing really that masks anything, right?
Leaving me to conclude that drinkability is simply a very different end result for you in terms of positioning yourself against the lager, against the Helles with a Saison.
Right.
Which is also, again, with the tradition of the terroir, a very, very traditional style.
Right. Actually it should be, right? I mean, it's how beer was made probably over generations or centuries ago, right? Probably most of the people did use a mixture of different wild yeasts. Beer was not really stable over a long course of, like, say, months, as we would talk in shelf life as today, because I think most of the beers actually turned sour sooner or later. So I think this is actually closer to, let's say, how beer was made historically, right? I'm not saying that we try to mimic this aspect. I'm just trying to take certain aspects of this, let's say, history, exactly, put myself in the 21st century and see what is it that I can use or learn from, like, all these stories. How can I actually make my beers today better or more interesting or more different than, let's say, other brands around?